of all the things I've done in my working life, the real high spot that I quote endlessly was when I was working in the very early 1980s, end of the 70s, early 80s, on a programme called the Priority Estates Project. And this was something which the Thatcher government set up with Michael Heseltine to basically empower the unempowered so that they could take control of their environment. And so I was working in Toxteth, I was working in every grim housing area you could think of. Everywhere I worked there were riots. And that you begin to wonder whether you're cause or effect in that kind of situation. But one of the places I was working in was the Tulse Hill estate in Brixton, which at the time was the worst housing estate in the Greater London Council. It was so bad that on Friday nights, the bin lorry guys didn't bother to go to the tip. They just took their trucks to the Tulse Hill estate and emptied them within the housing estate. So it was a real grim place. And then the Brixton riots happened, which some of you may remember, at least in folklore. Everything was trashed, everything was burned out. Nobody had touched the sunflowers on the Tulse Hill Nature Garden. Nobody. Because everybody on their estate knew that the children had grown them and that was why they mattered. So that kind of has lived with me ever since, really. Which is a kind of high spot in what has been a career of loss, really. I studied horticulture in the 1960s, and I always say I spent 3 years being taught how to kill everything, essentially, because that was what horticulture was in the 1960s. And I spent most of my student life as a student politician, actually, but nevertheless I was taught some stuff. And in 2023, the government published its State of Nature report. And what that basically was a record of how nature had fared between 1970 and 2023. My career began in 1970. 60% loss of farmland birds, for instance, just one of the catastrophic statistics. So my working career, which I think has been very optimistic and very positive and has touched lots of people, has actually been accompanied by this catastrophic environmental loss, driven very largely by the peers in my university education, the people who were one of my arch enemies on the student union executive went on to be the head of communications for ICI petrochemicals and agrochemicals. So there was this other bunch of people who went off into careers which drove what we've all been suffering from. So it's been a very interesting career and a very interesting period. But we're here to talk about environmental education. And on the table here, that I just grabbed my life's work, really, a whole bundle of stuff. And most of you will have something similar in a cardboard box in the loft somewhere. But it was quite salutary looking right back, because I was the first person to have an environmental series on children's television, on ITV, way back in the late 70s, on something called the Saturday Starship. And if you're really old, you will remember something called Tiswas, which was the most anachronistic children's television programme on Saturday mornings. Well, when Tiswas ended, they had to invent something else, and they invented Saturday Starship, which was the kind of boring cousin of Tiswas. But I was the environmentalist on the Saturday Starship, and I was green, clean and serene was my catchphrase, I seem to remember. Anyway, I dug out the Earth Pack, which was produced for the kids who were watching that programme way back in the 70s. And there's a whole kind of litany, really, of publications that run through that whole era of environmental education and trying to influence the influential, reach kids, use what was then the social media, which was television. Now, of course, it's quite different. So I, like Doug, have been around for a very long time, and Jonathan, we've both been a part of a rolling programme of ever-renewed optimism and ever-renewed determination to make a difference. And when you get towards the end of your career, you think, well, what was that all about then? Did it make any difference? And it's been really good just hearing about the Rachels as an example. And I had an example last week, actually. I was speaking at a two-day conference in Sheffield, which is actually, the conference was taking place half a mile from where I was born, right in the middle of the city of Sheffield. And it was a 2-day conference about plants. And there are two things, I think, that you hope for when you get to this stage of your career. One is that people are still learning and adding to the knowledge base. And the other is that there are people willing to pick up and continue the battle. And you've heard from the continuation bit just now, a few minutes ago. And I can honestly say I was there for one day, and I was there as the old stager talking about how things had changed. I can honestly say I have not been at a more stimulating and inspiring day's conference in my life than I was in Sheffield last Friday, week on Friday. 400 people from all over Europe talking about nature conservation, habitat creation, wildlife gardening. What was extraordinary for me was the depth and breadth of knowledge, stuff I never knew and never would have known had I not been to that thing last Friday. And just one example of that, which stuck with me, there was a guy who talked for far too long about solitary bees. Now, you would think that would be the great switch off. He kept people enraptured for 40 minutes about solitary bees. But the thing that I remember more than anything was that he was describing one particular species. And you all know that we all have bee hotels in our gardens and all those things with fir combs and everything else stuffed into the back of chicken wire. Most of which doesn't work, he was telling me. But he said fir combs just accommodate the spiders, which sit there waiting for the solitary bees to arrive. Yeah, I never thought about that. Anyway, he was describing just one species of solitary bee that he had observed drills its hole and lays its eggs into the cut ends of stems that have a soft, pithy core. So things like brambles, for instance, and roses, and elderberry that have that soft core. Here is a solitary bee species that requires that detail. And he was a gardener, so he's now pruning his roses differently to make sure that there are snagged ends to the roses that he's pruning to accommodate this one solitary bee, which happens also to predate on aphids. So accommodating that by bad pruning as a way of actually generating the natural pesticide squad of the rose garden. And I just sat there thinking, God, that is amazing. That depth of knowledge is what's been accumulated in 40 or 50 years of people bothering to look at gardens. Because that's actually, in my world, is what's changed. When I was involved in starting the first of the urban wildlife groups, back in about 1979, at the beginning of the Thatcher era, and there's a whole other story about Manpower Services Commission, which we've just been talking about, job creation. But at that moment, I was teaching in Birmingham, and there was a threat to a very large sand quarry in Birmingham, and it was threatened with landfill. And my students, my postgrad students, many of whom were members of Friends of the Earth at the time, were lobbying me to get involved with this campaign. To cut a very long story short, I wrote to the RSPB and said, there's this big hole in the ground in North Birmingham. It's going to be filled in and we'd really like your support. And this is back in 1976, 77, 78, something like that. The RSPB wrote back a very short letter saying, we've looked at where this is. There can't possibly be anything of interest for nature conservation there. And as a consequence, we lost a colony of 200 pairs of sand martins from the cliffs in that landfill site. So there's been an enormous shift, both in attitude and also in the knowledge base. So that's one thing that you hope, that actually people are learning and that we know more about our subjects now than we did 30 or 40 years ago. And the other thing is the point that Doug was just making. You hope that there has been some influence. Those kids, those little kids that I work with in Brixton on the Tulse Hill Nature Garden, will all now be grandparents. At the very least, they'll be grandparents. I have no idea where they went. I have no idea whether any of them remember those crazy days on a Sunday morning, grubbing about in the undergrowth. One thing I do know is that I would not be allowed to do what I was doing then, now. The idea of having 30 kids you didn't know and working in the undergrowth on a housing estate for 3 or 4 hours on a Sunday morning is just off limits. But last weekend at Sheffield, I was talking as I am now about all of this stuff, and I happened to mention that I live in Wolverhampton now. And at the end of it, one of these senior landscape architects came up to me and said, I come from Wolverhampton. So I said, do you know about the Wildside Activity Centre, which is something I've been the president of for 30 years now. It's a local canal-side nature study area. And there's a long tradition in Wolverhampton, actually going back to the First World War, of actually providing environmental education for infants. There's an extraordinary place in Wolverhampton called the Kingswood Centre, which was set up in the First World War for war widows and mothers with infants to actually go and have residential breaks so that their infants could learn about nature. It's still there 100 years later. Anyway, I said, do you know about the Wildside Activity Centre to this woman, who's now a senior landscape architect? And she said, I spent all my spare time there as a child. That's why I do what I do now. And it's the same basic message, that actually you have to keep believing that some of this stuff sticks, that it does make a difference. And although it's always dangerous to go back, I often think that I should just publish in the Brixton Messenger, or whatever the local rag is, one of the pictures of me with hair down here and a beard, grubbing about in the undergrowth with all these little kids, to say, where are they now? In the hopes that they're not all inside, but that some of them actually might have gone on to do something of significance in this whole field because of those Sunday mornings.